Welcome back. You are watching The Core, and we are discussing violence, intolerance, and sectarian killings in Nigeria. If you're at home and you want to join the conversation, you can do so on our social media handles, Twitter at Channels TV or at Adria Ahmed, YouTube at Channels Web. Please use the hashtag #NGTheCore. You can also follow us on Facebook at Channels Forum. Chris, let me come back to you. Before the break, the professor had alluded to a culture of violence, perhaps rooted in our military history, where I guess the state exercised a certain degree of control, through force. But what we have at the moment is that the state is no longer, if you like, the only owner of violence. And essentially, we have democratized violence. What impact has this had on the issues that we're facing?
It has a great impact. But could I just back up a bit
Sure.
and emphasize the centrality of identity politics too? The question you asked earlier about why it has become so easy for people to kill neighbors, identity politics by its very nature devalues the individual. That is what it does, because the individual does not matter. If I am Idoma, then that is, I'm not by myself, I have no value. I am only relevant because I belong to a larger group. So it is easier to dehumanize people where you have a rabid identity politics, such as we have. Secondly, under those conditions, the way people are socialized is also different. People are not socialized to see each other as compatriots or co-creators of national prosperity. They see each other as competitors for resources. So if you're in a land dispute, for example, that land dispute becomes an existential conflict. A resource conflict becomes an existential conflict, because if you don't have it, the other person will have it, and that is, not tolerable. So when you take that, this in fact feeds into this other narrative of the democratization of violence that we've seen. The state in many places has lost, let us say, legitimacy. So for example, 52% of Nigeria is rural. Rural communities are underserved by police resources, law enforcement assets, and all of that. So in many rural areas, you actually don't have a police station to report any kind of civil altercation to. What that has done, it has created a culture of self-help. People realize that the state cannot secure them, so they will find ways of securing themselves. So today we have a proliferation of ethnic militias or vigilante groups, most of them rooted in ethnic identity. So where you have a land conflict, for example, there is no court, there is no police station to go to. You arm yourselves, you take the young people, you weaponize them, and you have private armies all over the place. I also agree that the impact of military governance on our society is something that we really need to measure. We've not really come to terms with the impact of the militarization of the Nigerian psyche, to the extent that dialogue is not often the first resort. It is violence, first of all, to establish a balance of terror where there is conflict, before we eventually decide to talk. So these are the issues.
Okay, let me quickly bring in Kemi. Obviously, the failings of the state are huge. He's talked about the presence of ungoverned spaces where there's no state presence, the fact that the state is no longer seen as legitimate. And in many ways, that is correct, isn't it? Because the primary function of a state is to provide security first and foremost. And we don't see that happening. Why?
Let me back up a bit. My school of thoughts, when we kind of vilify the traditional or informal justice or policing system, I think that's not right. The government or the system, the nation state, is made up of different entities. The traditional institution, the traditional policing system, the traditional justice system have a role to play.
Right.
And if they are the closest to the people and they are the ones that engage the people effectively, the question you ask is, how have we built...
But shouldn't they be supplementing?
They're collaborating.
Right, okay.
Yeah, because the government, as we see it, the formal government, as we see it, cannot cover the space. Let's get that straight.
But the argument, though, is that there is even non-existent government to begin with. So these are the only systems that are available to people.
The challenge we have is that there's an erosion of the local government system, which is the closest arm of government to the people. Okay. So you're finding that's where the gap is. So when you ask local government authority, most of them caretakers, most of them appointed, not elected. It's also an element of administration that we do not pay attention to. If there's local government elections going to take place, nobody's going to pay attention to who's going to be your councillor, and that's the form, level of local government that is closest to the people. Where that does not exist, you have the traditional system which naturally exists, covering that space.
And yet, the system of policing or our security system is largely controlled from the federal level. That's the way we are structured. Your experience in Kaduna as a state government trying to sort of enforce security at a time of crisis, what are you finding are the challenges given that security is controlled at the center?
Well, thank you very much, Kareria. It's not been easy. We know that whenever we have conflicts in Kaduna, the police force, the army, and the air force, the military, have always are quick to come to our rescue. But it's been tough because it's not in every situation that the governor can give directives to the police authorities. There have been situations where we have asked them to move to certain areas, but they are waiting for certain commands or directives from their head office. You all agree with me by the enabling law establishing them, the police and the Nigerian military are not completely under the control. They are not under the control of the governor, even though we play a significant role in equipping them, in supporting them, even through intelligence sharing and all that from what we get from our traditional rulers, but we are not in control. So to a large extent, it's been a very, very serious challenge.
From the state point of view, are this, in your view, failing or failed institutions? Since they consistently are unable to...
No.
Well, I mean, prevention doesn't seem to be on their radar.
No. To a large extent, like the crisis we just had in Kaduna, the police and the military played a significant role in curtailing. It would have become.
But this is, I'm saying, is after the fact.
After the fact.
Surely part of what you do when you police properly is you actually do preventive policing.
Well, it is true that their intervention is preventive in most cases, but there have also been situations where we got intelligence even before the conflicts do emanate. And then when we have those intelligence, especially from the security service, we have a security council where we meet once every week, where we share this intelligence. So to a large extent, I would not agree that it's a failure. I know we would want them to do a lot better in our society, but I would not agree.
Let me engage the audience a little bit. The gentleman in the blue shirt, please don't forget to tell us who you are. And please keep it short, yeah? Time is very fast, right there. No, you need a mic. Is that mic on? I'm not too sure. Okay, all right. Go on.
Okay, my name is Abdullahi Haruna. There's something we're not touching. The trigger actors in crisis, manifestation. We're talking about religious institutions, educational institutions, and even the security institutions. The advent of violence in Nigeria actually started or manifested during the preach of supremacy of religion. That era where your religion is better or superior than my own. From if you do not accept Christ, you will not see, Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, you are not a believer. If you are not a Muslim, you are Arni. Religious leaders actually inculcated that in us, and that set the template for that deep-seated animosity that we have today.
I mean, to a certain extent, it's true, and I'd like us to talk about the role of religion when I come back to you. But that doesn't explain, for example, why two communities in Delta, you know, that are in a dispute over boundary demarcations will kill themselves. They mostly are likely to speak very similar languages and are also likely to worship in similar ways. That's not, I'm not dismissing, and I'd like the panel to actually jump in on this. Anybody regarding, I mean...
I'll say it's also a feature of the breakdown of the criminal justice system.
Right.
So criminality should be addressed as criminality. The law books tell us what murder is. However, when some of this violence, when some of these killings take place, you find those that are supposed to implement the law are the ones rationalizing
the reason for the killing.
Yes, the reason for the killing.
Okay. Well, what about the religious institutions? I mean,
I think what I would say is in agreement with you, but with another layer added on, is violence is multifaceted in Nigeria. So in northern Nigeria, for example, because religion was for a long time the organizing principle of northern Nigeria, when you have both politics and violence in northern Nigeria are layered with religious symbolism and religious metaphors. So in fact, religious institutions in northern Nigeria to a large extent are also socio-political institutions in a way that doesn't happen in the south. In the south, because ethnicity was the organizing principle of society for a long time, violence and politics in the south tend to be layered with ethnic symbolism and ethnic metaphors. And when you go further down south, you know, like in the south-south zone, where there was a long history of...
hang on, is that not because in the south there's a certain degree of cohesion in religion, and the north is a little bit more diverse, both in terms of, particularly in terms of religion? So you've got a huge Christian population, even if, you know, one could argue that the north is predominantly Islamic, and you don't have a similar sort of issue in the south. Is that not the case?
It's a common misconception, but if you're in the southwest, the demographics of the southwest are very plural, very diverse. The southwest is like the middle belt, you know, in terms of the distribution of communities along the lines of Islam and Christianity. So in fact, the Southwest is probably a case for positive deviance. If we're ever interested in asking, if you have diversity of faith in the Southwest, then why don't you have religious violence in the Southwest the way you have it elsewhere? But I was going to add that if you go to the Deep South, where there was a long history of secret societies, the violence that manifests there tends to adopt the metaphors and the cultural rights of those secret societies. That is what we call cult violence or cultism, although it's just simply gangsterism wearing cultural garments. So the point is that violence simply wears the cultural garments of different localities. The base factors are probably the same. It's the collapse of the criminal justice system, what to do with millions of alienated young people, and the culture of violence generally that we have. But depending on the locality, it will adopt certain traits, certain characteristics. It would be a mistake to focus on the characteristics or the garments rather than what is wearing them. So in parts of Kaduna, for example, what you have is actually gangsterism. But by the time it assumes full manifestation, you assume that it is religious communities that are fighting. And I would add lastly that there are class dynamics to this that we need to pay attention to. So if you're in Kaduna, for example, a lot of the fighting would go on in Badarawa, right? Badarawa is a slum next door to Malali. Yeah. If you're in Malali, nothing happens to you in Malali. If you are in Jos, most of the unrest happens in Angwan-Rogo. If you are in Rayfield, nothing happens to you. So there are also class dimensions to the geography of violence that we need to pay attention to.
Okay, so the underlying subtext there, and I want to bring the prof in here, is that poverty and lack of opportunities might actually also play a role. I know you've studied...
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, you know...
Absolutely. In fact, if you look at definitions of national security, those definitions are beginning over time to shift in terms of incorporating sustainable development. So it's no longer security in terms of armed forces going to fight there or pressure on environmental resources. They are now beginning to address core issues of poverty, the unemployment, you know, all the financials are coming in, all the poverty indicators, they're all playing in. They're all coming now in the definitions. So we're beginning to see the impact of this security on a range of variables. First, if you look at macroeconomic indicators, you're going to see how it affects each and every macroeconomic indicator. And I could name them: inflation, GDP, all of them. All these factors are affected. You go and look at socioeconomic indicators, they're all affected. If you look at the budget, you see how security grows with national budget in a linear form, and then you correlate that to GDP.
So the better a society does,
you look at provisioning for health in the budget, look at education, you find them in inverse relationships, showing that the trajectory is upward for security-based expenditures, whereas all the other indices that are connected to poverty and sustainable development are all inverse relations. So you're going to have more competition. In fact, while the population is growing phenomenally, there's what they call the demographic time bomb, which says that in the year 2030, there'll be 400 million Nigerians.
Okay, I'm going to have to take a quick break. I'll come back to you. Don't go away.